Hello, this is Dr. Scott Catino of Henley Putnam University, and I put together this video lecture on the challenges of researching in the security field. Our objectives today are threefold. First, we want to identify the major obstacles to conducting effective research in the security field. I think this is critically important. Far too often, when researchers begin to discuss, or I should say, analyze and research a subject in the security field, they often do so not realizing there are significant obstacles that affect the quality of their research. So we want to look at some of these obstacles today. Secondly, an objective here is to demonstrate how these obstacles affect research in the security field. We want to understand not just what these obstacles are, but how they are affecting our research, really our quality of research on these security matters that we are studying and analyzing. And third, we want to sensitize ourselves as researchers to these obstacles and therefore begin the process of overcoming them. A major problem that researchers in the security field have is they simply begin to delve into the large amounts of research that exist on the subject. There are many journalist accounts of security, acts of terrorism, subjects like Al Qaeda, subjects that would include Hezbollah, and the many other groups. There are many scholars that have written on this subject, and there are large amounts of data, whether in archives or electronic databases. And with all this information, it's far too tempting to simply accept it at face value, not realizing that there are deficiencies in all these areas and in the quality of research. And I think that's brought out very clearly by some of the studies that have looked into the field and methods of terrorism studies and have found that so many of the research databases and information that is just so easily accepted are in fact very flawed. And we have to be careful because some of these sources actually do have excellent information. We need to supplement these sources by getting closer to the subject and focusing on primary data and realizing the qualities and deficiencies of each of these sources that we have here. The journalist sources often are excellent in uncovering information, but sometimes are flawed because they focus on the highly visible, the dramatic, that which catches the eye. But in fact, it could be in the security topic that you're studying, the unspoken, underreported, or unreported acts of terrorism, let's say, that have been thwarted by the government may be the most significant. Scholarly sources are so often flawed because they rest not on empirical observations, field research, and other methods where the researcher is up close and either observing or participating in uh, the data collection, but on theoretical perspectives. And thus, the distance causes a problem in accuracy. And even archives, which are often excellent and bringing out the information, the historical trends, um, the population information that's so critical, cultural aspects. Even archives can be misleading in that they do not keep pace with the rapidly changing security environment that we study. So it's important to understand the qualities and deficiencies of these sources and to begin to move closer to primary source data, field research, and to make that a major objective. But obviously, the first real obstacle in entering into the security field and getting up close to the information is that there's a danger to human security. That is to say, the lives and the welfare of the researcher. It is obviously and often a very lethal environment that poses a risk to the researcher, and we should not downplay this. We have to be careful of accidental death, which so often happens in a combat zone or what's considered a danger zone or a high risk zone. The fact of the matter, one of the most dangerous things you do when entering one of these conflict areas or the security field is simply traveling. The quality of the roads are often poor. The vehicles themselves may be very poor, and the individual actually doing the driving may not be the most qualified. Add to that the problems of bridges, the problems of infrastructure. We can generalize and say the very threat scenario and risk is far broader in a conflict zone than that which is seen or undertaken or experienced in the normal course of social science research. And we need to understand these types of potential hazards. We need to plan for them, be prepared for them, and begin to certainly work around them so they pose far less of a risk. I want to call attention to entry and exit into a security zone. Often the entry and exit could be among the most dangerous thing that a researcher does. Simply to enter into an area may take a bit of understanding and finesse, and even to exit some of these areas can be very difficult. There are many stories of researchers entering certain neighborhoods, certain areas, and conducting their research only to find that after gaining government permission, finding uh, excellent interpreters and field guides, being able to make critical contacts, and after conducting lengthy observations, the population could become hostile. There could indeed be a high level of crime that's encountered, and to extract yourself from that situation or to be forced to exit the country may actually be a danger within and of itself. So this is something that has to be accounted for. So, how do we deal with all this? We have to be careful with distance. We often trade safety for accuracy, and we have to be careful that as we step back away from a conflict zone, we could indeed be losing much accuracy. So, using distance to create scope and understanding while remaining focused on our subject and being very understanding of the sources that we're using to gain information will help us to offset this natural tendency to step back and move back from these security zones and the loss of accuracy that takes place. We also have to be careful of this whole issue of restriction, rejection, and ejection. When we develop a focus on our subject of security, it should indeed include the three major areas: the actual insurgent group or terrorist group, which I have depicted here, the counterinsurgent, government forces that oppose the security threat, and the actual population. These three groups and areas will indeed have the most accurate information usually. And that's not to say it should be looked at uncritically, but to get as close as possible to this is very important for gaining the type of primary data that we're looking for. And our methods then should be used to get us as close as possible to these areas. But as we do so, we have to be careful and understand that there is indeed restriction. Government restriction to the very area and information that we seek is an obstacle. There is something called classified information we're well aware of, as well as governments restricting physically access to these areas and penalizing those who enter these areas. Even during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that we were involved in, this was not simply an area where any individual or researcher could walk into. There had to be a level of permission that was gained to simply enter these areas. So we have to be cognizant of this and understand access as being a part of our research. We also have to keep in mind rejection of the researcher, research aims, and research outcomes. Oftentimes, terrorist groups obviously do not want to speak to researchers, and particularly those who had a military background. So to take a step or two back from these groups and study their primary source data is often the very best move to make. Even when a researcher, a security expert, begins to make contact with the counterinsurgents, they're often concerned about and very hesitant to discuss these issues that could affect their career. There's a concern about revealing not only classified information, but sensitive information. And these are major obstacles to the researcher. And we'll find, as I mentioned previously, that even populations, as I mentioned, can reject the researcher and indeed eject them from an area even after government access may be gained. Critical contacts are made within the field to begin to enter the area and conduct research. The fact the population itself may become hostile. And oftentimes, throughout the world, when a security researcher enters an area and begins to conduct interviews or some other type of observation, they're viewed as by the local population as being spies. And this is an obstacle to overcome. So again, we have to understand what methods we're using to get close and what cost there is for distance. Denial and deception. This is what makes our field much more unique in our research, and this obstacle is far deeper there. We have to keep in mind that denial and deception operations are a routine aspect of insurgent and terrorist activity that taint the information of the security environment. This happens routinely and often, and the fact of the matter is that the involvement in denial and deception, willingly and unwillingly, of governments, media, the population, and other researchers compounds the deception and obstructs the research even further. You may be entering an area not realizing that there has been such a high level of denial and deception, disinformation campaigns taking place, that even when you gain access to these difficult areas, or you have contacted individuals, you were able to use the internet to make your level of contact either through the phone or through some other form of communication. The fact of the matter is, the level of information may be very tainted. So this is indeed something that we have to work around in the security field. Also, hidden populations. So much of the research, the subject populations, the actors, the very subjects that we study in the security field are not operating in the open and thus constitute what is called hidden populations. And I have a picture here of an illegal alien being apprehended. And if you think about that subject in particular, illegal aliens, whether someone is looking at the illegal immigration coming from Mexico's or what's called OTMs other than Mexicans, or whatever group of illegal alien being studied, this is obviously a hidden population, very difficult to access. This is not something where you can easily go into an area and have people identify themselves as illegals. Obviously, the consequence of being exposed for that is very high. So to even access that type of population, this hidden population, is difficult. And the same thing could be said about terrorism, even former terrorists who may be willing to speak. These individuals, groups, and issues are thus far more difficult to locate, research, and interact with. And that is simply a challenge that we have to face in the security field, which is contrasted to other areas in the social sciences and research that are far easier to locate and to access. We also have to understand how these issues that we discuss, analyze, and research in the security field, how highly politicized and manipulated they are. And that's not to say this does not exist in other fields and other areas, but I would assert that our field, the security field, because the costs and consequences are so high to political authority and to human security, that these are often far more intense in the way they're politicized and manipulated. We look at an issue like the Ukrainian crisis, where the researcher may simply go into this area, be focused on the subject, and may have the ability to enter, to access, and remain focused on the key players that certainly can provide this primary data. But the environment is so politically charged and manipulated that that factor and thrust of research, in essence, is reversed. And the direction changes, where instead of focusing on the subject is actually focusing on you. And I've entered areas like this where the intensity of politicization and manipulation is so high that the individuals will be seeking you out to either bias, taint, or outright negate the type of research you're doing. And this is so often the case, and one that we need to understand. It certainly is a very high challenge in the security field. There are also significant ethical considerations. Ethical considerations are a part of any research project, but there are certainly additional ones to consider in our field. That is to say, in the security research field. As I mentioned, information is often classified. So to deal with this type of information, meaning to try to speak to individuals in the security field who may give classified information, is just very unethical to do. It endangers individuals, their lives and careers, and is illegal, and is, again, something that we as researchers have to be very careful of. Quite frankly, we need to steer clear of classified information. We should not seek it out. We should not report on it. And if there is spillage, we need to be very ethical about it and not indeed to publish it, but in fact, quite the opposite, to make sure that we're not a part of that process. There's often the issue of illegality. There might be issues that you're studying in terrorism or even accessing individuals who have been quiet about this subject for a long time. And as we begin to conduct interviews or become a part of the, or I should say, contact our subjects, we find that information that is brought out could actually become illegal, in addition to bringing up the pain and suffering of someone who may have forgotten the very subject that you're addressing and talking about. So we're bringing up issues that deal with classified information, illegalities, and a host of emotional pain in our subject, and we have to be very careful of this issue as we're doing our research. We are dealing with human subjects, and there's often a risk to the actual subject that we have to be very careful of as we conduct our research. And there's also an issue of sensitivity. Even if something is not classified, even if it's legal, the fact that we are gathering information and we begin to put it together, it may become sensitive. Now, how do we define what is sensitive information? When it begins to put security at risk or individuals, the very human subjects we're dealing with, at risk, we need to begin to back away from that and generalize it rather than getting specific, too specific, where we're putting individuals or security issues at risk. So we have to be very careful of that. Very careful of that as an ethical consideration. And then there's also an issue of budget approval and requirements. The subject of security research is not as highly prioritized as some other areas of research, let's say in the social sciences that deal with human populations, or particularly an economic issue, or perhaps a certain ethnographic study, or a subject that deals with class. There's often limited research budgets to deal with these topics, and there's often a difficulty in communicating these research objectives. To begin to look at these highly specialized subjects, to communicate their importance to groups and individuals of influence, there's often a disconnect in that this field is different than the others and may not be as clearly understood. And that point is particularly relevant when dealing with institutional research boards. The field of security is often misunderstood. Its relevancy, its operations, its relationship to human subjects is not commonly understood. So very often field researchers report in their very own studies the difficulty in communicating exactly what type of research it is, how it affects these human populations, and to communicate that in such a way that an institutional research board can understand is sometimes very challenging. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to have effective communication skills, and we're often instructing and teaching as we go along to create that level of understanding. Okay, we've come to the end of this lecture here, and let's summarize some of these challenges. What were our key points? What do we want to understand? We want to understand and anticipate the major obstacles to conducting effective research in the security field. We have to be very careful we don't casually enter into our data, not realizing the inaccuracies, the biases of our research, but we want to begin to understand distance and move closer to our subject, having a focus on the three critical areas: the actual insurgent or terrorist, the counterinsurgent, and the populations affected by these security issues. We want to get closer to that data. We want to understand the sources that are closer to that data. We want to understand the methods that bring us closer to that data. And as we do so, we will encounter challenges. We want to understand these problems, these obstacles, and how and what they pose for conducting research in the security field. They range from obstacles that affect our very security and life and well-being to obstacles that degrade the quality of our research. Understanding that range is very important. And finally, We want to become not just aware of these, but sensitive to these obstacles, and therefore begin the process of overcoming them. Granted that this presentation, this video lecture, focused on the obstacles rather than the solutions on how to overcome them. That was done intentionally so that the security researcher becomes sensitive to these obstacles. The first step in overcoming them is indeed to be aware of them and to become sensitive to them. This subject of field research, understanding primary source data, and supplementing the vast bodies of research that we have in the security field with indeed a closer perspective in utilizing primary data has been discussed widely by scholars in the terrorism field, these actual field researchers that enter these conflict zones and have much to report on. I very much encourage the students at Henley Putnam to begin to understand these obstacles and then begin to delve into the literature that's listed here by experienced field researchers that have worked in the security field. It's imperative to do so. And as always, as you have questions or may have questions, feel free to contact me at my email, and I would be happy to discuss these topics further with you, as well as to help you with any research or any particular aspect of this subject. I do think it's very much worthwhile, and I think that it's so critical that our information is accurate because so much depends on it. Thank you very much for listening to this video lecture.